At 11 a.m. on November 6, 2001, a customer arrived at the Hair Gallery Salon in Florence, Montana for her appointment with owner Dorothy Harris. As she walked up to the business, she noticed a man in a dark suit with a hat in front of the salon. She didn't think much of it until she stepped inside and discovered a horrific scene. Dorothy, her employee Brenda Patch, and their customer Cynthia Paulus had been brutally murdered. When investigators heard about the man in the hat, they believed he was likely the killer. But despite multiple sketches and an intensive search, he has never been identified. More than 20 years later, the murders of Dorothy, Brenda, and Cynthia remain unsolved, and investigators are still searching for the person or people responsible. Hey everyone, welcome back to Detective Perspective. My name is Derrick Levasseur. I'm a licensed private investigator and former police detective. Each week I'll be covering an unsolved case in story format. I'll then give you my perspective on the investigation and provide contact information for the individuals or organizations connected to the case so that if you have any tips, you can contact them directly and maybe you can help solve a case. So if you're someone who's interested in true crime, specifically unsolved cases, and you would like to hear my opinion on those investigations, please consider subscribing whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use. Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about the Florence Salon murders, and it reminds me a lot of the Lane Bryant murders as well, if you've seen that episode where we covered that case. And for me, I've been going back and forth on this one. In fact, I was just in the gym and I started to go down a path and then I said, nope, can't go there. That wouldn't work, or that box can't be checked. And then I think about what happened in this case and the fact that there's already been somebody arrested for these crimes. We'll just leave it there for now. And yet 20 years later, we don't have justice. We don't have someone being held accountable for what's happened here, or I wouldn't be covering it. And so I usually, after I get done researching everything, I have my notes. I'll go back and forth with it. I'll go home. I'll throw some gel in the hair, and then I'll come back here and record my episode. But after I got done in the gym, I hopped in the shower, came right in here, and I wanted to get my thoughts out on camera before I forgot them. So here we are. I don't want to waste any time. Let's dive into this week's case. Dorothy Harris was born and raised in Montana. At 15, she began dating Ed Harris, the man she would later marry. The couple eventually settled in Florence, a small town in western Montana along Highway 93. At the time, Florence had fewer than 1,000 residents and just a handful of businesses. Dorothy and Ed raised 5 children together. Ed worked as a farmer, while Dorothy worked as a hairdresser. She also ran a craft shop inside the building that once served as the town's post office at 5355 West US 93. According to the Missoulian, the building sat in the middle of Florence's business section, which wasn't very big at all. But Dorothy liked her spot because it was easy to see from the road and close to a residential area. Being a business owner also meant that Dorothy was well known in the community. Friends said she was the type of person who would help anybody at any time, no matter who they were. By the late 1990s, Dorothy and Ed were in their 60s, and they had been married for decades. They had 16 grandchildren and 2 grandchildren, and the couple really enjoyed their time as grandparents while still keeping busy with work. In early 2000, Dorothy decided to transform her craft shop into a hair and nail salon. She had partnered with her nephew Scott, but he soon left to start his own shop in another town. Dorothy invested a lot of time and money into remodeling the building before reopening it under a new name, the Hair Gallery. She also hired a manicurist named Brenda Patch to work alongside her. The Missoulian described Brenda as a wonderful, caring person who was very close to her family. She and her husband Mike had been married for 24 years. They had 2 grown children and a baby grandson that Brenda absolutely adored. Brenda loved doing nails, and by all accounts, she and Dorothy really got along well. At around 8 a.m. on Tuesday, November 6, 2001, Dorothy arrived to open the hair gallery. An hour later, the salon opened for the day, and Brenda showed up for her 10 a.m. appointment with Cynthia Paulus, a 71-year-old grandmother of 11 who loved fishing, horses, and spending time with her husband Jerry. Now, what's unfortunate here is Cynthia usually booked her appointments on Fridays, but that particular week she came in on a Tuesday because she wanted her nails done before a University of Montana basketball game that evening. Not long after Cynthia sat down for her 10 a.m. appointment, Dorothy left to go to the bank. Tuesdays were always her banking day since the salon was closed on Sunday and Mondays. At 10:30 a.m., Dorothy finished at the bank and headed back to the salon. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. 30 minutes later, at 11 a.m., a customer arrived for her hair appointment with Dorothy, but instead found her in the fetal position in a pool of blood near the back door. The customer immediately called the police, and when deputies from the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office arrived, they cleared the building immediately. According to the Missoulian, they then found 44-year-old Brenda and 71-year-old Cynthia in the back utility room where the hair dye was stored. Both women were dead, and the room showed signs of a violent struggle. All three victims had been killed by having their throats slit. Brenda and Cynthia also had cuts on their arms, palms, and fingers, likely from trying to defend themselves. Investigators searched the scene but never found the weapon, which they believed was a knife. They did note that cash and personal items like purses were still in place, which suggested robbery was not the motive. There was also no evidence of the victims being bound or sexually assaulted. The only things that appeared to be missing were two of the salon's hairdressing capes, which are pretty common. I know when I sit in the chair, my barber will put it around my neck to make sure that the hair doesn't get on my clothes. And I think we all wear them, right? Whether you're getting your hair dyed or you're getting your hair cut, it's a preventative measure to make sure you don't get stuff all over you. And as far as I know, as I sit here right now, those two capes have never been recovered. And as far as these capes are concerned, there's been some speculation out there. Some people believe that the killer or killers may have put these capes on to protect themselves from getting blood all over their clothes. To me, that seems like a stretch. I don't think these killers came in there, grabbed the capes from the other chairs, put them on, and then attacked Cynthia and Brenda. I'm just not seeing it. To me, what the capes might suggest is whether this was one person or two people who committed this crime. After they did whatever they did, whatever weapons they had, whatever they might have had on them that had blood on it, they wanted to take it with them, but they didn't want people to see it. So in my opinion, it's also possible that they took the knife and whatever bloody clothes they were wearing, they stuffed them inside this cape, kind of tied it up and made it a little bag and made it easier to carry out without having anything left behind. That would be my best guess. But as I sit here right now, I don't have any evidence to rule out that first theory, although I do believe that my theory is more likely. Just think about it, right? You go in there, the crime occurs, now you're looking over everything that could potentially connect you to the crime, whether it's something you touched or weapons you used. You place them all in a central location on the floor on top of this cape, then you tie it up, you throw it over your shoulder or under your jacket, and you can get out of there without any transfer evidence occurring on your way out of that location. We'll never know unless we catch this person. I will say the fact that two were missing is suspicious. I'd also like to acknowledge that they believe two were missing. I'd like to know how they came to that conclusion, and is it possible that maybe it was only one or none at all? The only person who could really fill in that blank for us would be Dorothy, and unfortunately, she's no longer with us. According to the Ravalli Republic, a team from the state crime lab in Missoula responded to process the scene. Investigators later revealed that they recovered a palm print, but they never shared any further details. They also found a pair of black-rimmed wraparound sunglasses in the middle of the crime scene. They didn't belong to any of the victims, leading some investigators to wonder if they came from the killer during the struggle. The sunglasses were sent off for testing, but just like the palm print, it doesn't appear at least that anything came from it. And I do want to throw the sunglasses up on the screen here. You can see what they look like. It would appear to me that this would be the type of sunglasses you would wear if you wanted to cover up a large portion of your face. And I think it's very likely that the theory that's being laid out here is exactly what happened. There's a struggle and the glasses come off, and in a rush to get out of there as fast as possible, the offender forgets the glasses behind, doesn't throw them in the cape or however they were storing their weapons and everything else. And this is the one thing that we really do have linking to the killer. And I don't want to go too far here, but just looking at it, This does appear to be something that a male would wear, not a female. And I think it would be easy to go to all the victims' families and show these glasses and say, hey, was this theirs? They would quickly rule it out. And then through process of elimination, you're only left with the one other person who wasn't at the crime scene, and that would be the killer. Investigators also spoke with the customer who had arrived for her appointment at 11 a.m. She told them she saw the man walking south in front of the salon as she came in. This man was described as being in his 20s or 30s, about 6 feet tall, 180 pounds, with no facial hair. He wore a white shirt, a dark suit, an overcoat or duster, and a hat described as either a stovepipe or a fedora. After hearing all of this, investigators believed that the customer had in fact seen the killer. They knew they were going to need more resources, so they brought in the FBI and other agencies to try and help track down the man in the hat. And I do want to point out here that, in case any of you didn't pick up on the date, this was right after September 11th. So I did see a video where the sheriffs were talking about trying to get the FBI to come in and help them out because they needed more resources. But unfortunately, with the tragedy of September 11th, most of the FBI agents were working that case. Understandably, it was a horrific incident. So just really bad timing here, because if it wasn't right after 9/11 had occurred, there would have been a lot more agents on the ground in Montana working this case, and maybe we would have a different outcome. So after examining the initial crime scene, investigators fanned out to canvass the area around the salon. Neighbors in the residential neighborhood behind the salon reported seeing the man in the hat. In these sightings, he wasn't wearing the coat, but they thought he was carrying something. He didn't speak to anyone, but witnesses said he appeared focused, walking with purpose rather than running. And this was part of the reason I came to the conclusion that possibly this man used the cape he had taken from the salon to kind of store everything that could incriminate him, to make sure he didn't drop it, and to also make sure that it wasn't noticed by a passerby. Let's say he had blood on the jacket or had a bloody knife in his hand. You're not going to carry those things out in the open because someone's going to remember that. However, if you take it off and you wrap it up in this cape, which has like a nylon material to it, which would trap in any moisture, now you're just a guy walking down the road carrying something that appears to be a bag. Clearly, that's not going to stand out as much. And according to the Missoulian, after speaking with these neighbors, investigators pieced together the killer's movements based on these witness accounts. After being spotted in front of the salon, he went to the south side of the building, then through the alley. From there, he continued south on Linder Street, then onto First Street, where witnesses saw him jumping a fence to cut through a parking lot. He was last seen in a wooded area south of One Horse Creek Road, less than a half a mile from the salon. The entire area was searched, but as far as we know, nothing of value was found. And I do want to mention that a dog team from Missoula was brought in, and they were able to track a scent from the salon to a house near One Horse Creek Road, but that's where it stopped. And that house was searched, but apparently it was not connected, leading investigators to believe that the man they were actually after had probably gotten into a vehicle outside of that house. So as the search for the man continued, investigators also worked to establish a timeline for when the murders could have occurred. Since Brenda and Cynthia were still alive when Dorothy left the salon to go to the bank at 10 a.m., and the customer discovered the scene at 11 a.m., investigators knew the window was no more than an hour. And they were able to narrow that down even further using context clues. So according to the Rivali Republic, Cynthia's nails weren't finished when they found her. The old polish had been removed, but the new color hadn't been applied yet. In addition to that, Brenda's nail drill was still running when officers arrived, and the iced coffee at her station still had ice in it. So based on these details, investigators believe the earliest that the attack could have started was around 10:30 a.m., and I agree. In addition to that information, they also knew that Dorothy left the bank at 10:30, which meant she likely returned to the salon between 10:45 and 10:50. We also know that she parked near the back door, just a few feet away from where her body would later be found. So she entered the salon through the back, and likely that's where she encountered her killer. From the timeline and the evidence found at the scene, investigators theorized that the killer entered the salon through the front door sometime after 10:30. He quickly overpowered Brenda and Cynthia, so quickly that, as I mentioned earlier, Brenda didn't even have time to turn off her drill. And at that point, more than likely, he forced the two women into the utility room. After killing Brenda and Cynthia, the killer likely headed for the exit, and that's when he encountered Dorothy, who had just returned from the bank. And that's when he attacked her near the back door, and within minutes, the killer fled the salon, crossing paths with that customer who had arrived for their 11 a.m. appointment. And I agree with this theory for the most part. I mean, there's not a lot of detective work that has to go into it. You have a very small window. You know where the bodies were found. You know the condition that the salon was found in with the drill still being on. So you know it was a sneak attack. You know that. And based on where Dorothy was found near that back door, you know she was caught off guard. As soon as she walked in, she was killed. The question that I have, and in my opinion, the jury's still out on this one, is did the killer, while walking out the back exit, run into Dorothy, not expecting to see her? Or did this person know she was going to the bank, knew she would be back shortly, and was waiting behind the door for her? The answer to that question would be huge in this case, because if this was just a random act of violence and the killer didn't actually know his victims, I could see the first scenario. But if this was a targeted attack, you could make the argument that a more possible theory here would be the killer goes in, kills Cynthia and Brenda, knowing Dorothy's about to return, so he does it fast. He waits for Dorothy, kills her because they know she's going to be walking in through that back door any second, and then after that, that's when they flee. There's a real possibility that the killer killed Brenda and Cynthia in the utility room and had plenty of time to leave before Dorothy arrived. Might have only been 3 or 4 minutes, but still plenty of time to get out of the line of sight. Is it possible that this person waited behind and wanted to make sure that Dorothy was killed as well? And if that's what happened here, now you have to ask yourself why. Who is this person? What acts did they have to grind with Dorothy? What did they tie her to where they felt that she needed to be killed? It's a tough theory to explore without knowing all the details of Dorothy's background, and there's nothing from what I found that would suggest Dorothy was involved in anything nefarious, although I will say, I kind of teased it at the beginning, there is something that's going to come up here that's worth exploring, and this kind of leads into that. But yes, as I sit here right now, all of this kind of makes sense, except for, did they just run into each other, meaning Dorothy and the killer, or was this a planned attack? Back to the timeline, because we're still on November 6th, the day of the murders. That same evening, the sheriff's office provided an update to the public. They said the investigation was ongoing, no arrests had been made, and there were no suspects or major leads. Investigators also said they wanted to identify and speak with the man in the hat to see if he knew anything about the murders. His description was shared with the public and sent to agencies across the state. As the search for the man in the hat continued, investigators looked closely at each victim. They explored both business and personal relationships within the families, and this ended up being a fairly easy lead for investigators to follow because everyone who knew the victims cooperated, agreeing to interviews and providing DNA samples. According to the Raleigh Republic, every single person who knew the victims was shocked by the brutal killings. They couldn't understand how it happened, and they couldn't think of a single person who would want to hurt them. Investigators kept digging, obtaining search warrants for financial statements, insurance records, telephone records, DNA samples. They even got palm prints from family members and friends. They wanted to know if anyone could have benefited from one or more of the deaths. But in the end, nothing pointed back to the families, and investigators said that while they weren't officially ruled out, because no one would be until an arrest was made, they felt they had exhausted every avenue and found no evidence of involvement. In the weeks that followed, the investigation continued in full force. Investigators interviewed more people in the area and collected surveillance tapes from every store they could find. They also released multiple sketches to the public. In fact, there were 5 in total. 2 were showing the man in the hat's outfit. The other 2 were composites of his face. A third version showed him wearing sunglasses paired with a photo of a real pair of black sunglasses similar to the ones found at the scene. And from there, tips did pour in, but none of them led investigators to the man they were looking for. As the investigation stalled, detectives turned to FBI profilers because they wanted to know if the Florence murders fit into any known patterns. And what they found was that this case was an anomaly. There was nothing else like it. Sheriff Johnson told the Missoulian that one of their main questions was about the knife. They wanted to know if they should be looking for someone who is trained in using one. In the end, the FBI told them, quote, "It may be somebody with efficiency who has training, but it may not." Johnson went on to say, quote, "They were very adamant about that. It doesn't have to be someone with special training, just someone who was invested and who was a cool, calm person to begin with. That might be one of those personality traits." The profilers also cautioned investigators not to focus only on the man in the hat. They said he might have been involved, but he may not have been. It was even possible that he had been working with someone else. So they warned investigators to keep all options open. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it feels like the last few episodes where I've talked about profilers, I've been harsh. But I wanted to put this in here for this reason because to me, it's kind of pointing out the obvious. It may be the guy in the hat. It may not be. It may be someone with special knife training. It may not be. Don't get too focused on one person because it could be someone else. I would hope these are all things that the original investigators had already deduced. I will say, maybe reading between the lines, could FBI profilers have come in, saw what the investigation was currently focusing on and said, "Hey, you guys are getting a little too much tunnel vision on this man in the hat." Yes, probability, it's him. But it's also possible it's not. So just make sure we're exploring all options. If that's what they were doing, just, keeping the checks and balances, I respect that. But as far as the actual profile itself, I'm listening to it, I'm reading it just like you guys, and I'm not getting much out of it other than it could be anybody. Thanks. But I do respect FBI profilers. I've met a few of them, very intelligent people, and they've worked on numerous cases and have been a huge help. I just think in these particular investigations that we've covered, they're trying to do their best, but unfortunately they're not magicians and they just didn't have a lot of substance to offer here. The investigation carried into the new year, and in February of 2002, investigators released an updated sketch of the man in the hat. It was their most detailed version yet, but it still didn't bring them any closer to finding the killer. By November of 2002, a full year had passed since the murders. Investigators told the Rivali Republic that 2 or 3 people were still working on the case almost every day. They took in the tips and followed the leads from other agencies. Even so, they were still no closer to solving the case. Investigators weren't sure if the man in the hat was the killer, if more than one person was involved, or even what weapon was used. They also had different theories about the motive, some thinking it was targeted, others leaning towards a random act of violence. And as I said earlier in this episode, this case is going to take a very interesting turn, and that turn is the arrest of 2 individuals for these murders. We're going to talk about it right after the break. You ever go through something tough? The answer is yes. Everybody has gone through something tough, whether it's a breakup, burnout, or even just that creeping anxiety that doesn't let you sleep at night and you're laying there thinking, I wish I had someone who I could talk to who actually gets it. I've been there, and I've seen how powerful therapy can be. Not just for me, but for my friends, for my family, and for the people close to me who were really struggling at the time and needed help. But let's be honest, getting access to the right therapist can be a nightmare. You call around and people aren't taking new clients, they're not in your network, or it costs a fortune, and that's where Rula comes in. Rula is changing the game. They make high-quality mental health care accessible and affordable for everyone. Most people only pay $15 a session, and they take most major insurance. You answer a few quick questions, and you're matched with a licensed professional who meets your preferences, and you can be talking to someone as soon as the next day. And Rula doesn't just leave you hanging after that. They actually stay with you, checking in on your progress and making sure you get what you need out of therapy. Whether it's a therapist or even a psychiatrist to help with medication management, Rula has got you covered. So if you've been thinking about therapy, or even if this is the first time you've considered it, this is your sign. Thousands of people have already trusted Rula to support them on their journey toward improved mental health and overall well-being. So head over to rula.com/detective to get started today. After you sign up, they're going to ask you where you heard about them. please support this show by telling them that we sent you. I would greatly appreciate it. Once again, that's rula.com/detective to take the first step towards better mental health today. You deserve quality care from someone who cares. Okay, we're back, and after the 1-year mark, reporting in the case slowed down. There were no major developments until 2008, when a bombshell dropped. In April of that year, 2 men, Brian Weber and Lincoln Benavidez, were indicted for the murders of Dorothy, Brenda, and Cynthia, along with multiple drug charges. This next part might be a little bit confusing, so please just try to stick with me here. The indictment alleged that Lincoln ran a drug trafficking operation that moved methamphetamine and marijuana into Montana. The drugs were distributed through a network of dealers across 4 counties. According to the Raleigh Republic, Brian Weber was alleged to be one of those dealers. He also collected money for Lincoln, often through threats or violence. How this is all tied to the murders at the hair gallery salon is unclear. Most of the court records remain sealed, and the general theory reported on was that Lincoln ordered Brian to kill the women as a way to collect on a drug debt owed by someone connected to them. But as you probably assumed, not everyone agreed with that version. Former Missoulian crime reporter Michael Moore later told KPAX that his reporting pointed to something different. He said, quote, "I talked to a number of people here and they told me it was not someone connected to them, but that it was one of the women." Moore went on to say, quote, "That person had run afoul of Lincoln on the end of a bunch of money which wasn't where it was supposed to be, and that Brian was sent in to reinforce the message or something." So this theory is pretty out there, and I had kind of alluded to it at the top of the show. It seems like a stretch to me, but as I sit here and as we end up going into the perspective, how do I professionally sit here and rule it out? What basis, what authority do I have to say it's not possible? Dorothy, Brenda, Cynthia could have all been great women. I know a lot of great people who have made bad decisions. In most cases, the criminals that I deal with, they fit that category. It's very rare that I get someone who is truly evil. I've said this quote a million times. I've probably said it on here. A lot of the times it's good people just making bad decisions. And is it possible that's what happened here? Is it possible that one of these women got tied up into something and they were involved in a money laundering scheme, or just maybe serving as a front? In that case, it would be Dorothy. And Brian and Lincoln decided to go to this extreme to send a message. I guess it's possible. We're sitting here 20 plus years later and we don't know what happened. So sure, it's possible. It seems pretty out there for me. And I'll talk about it now instead of the perspective, because it won't make a lot of sense if we save it to the end. But if it were to be a targeted attack where they were sending a message, it's not Cynthia, right? Cynthia's making an appointment to get her nails done. This wasn't even her scheduled day. She's usually there on Friday. She shows up on a Tuesday. So I would like to rule her out. Then you have Brenda and you have Dorothy. And if it was Brenda, then the killer goes in there, sees Brenda, sees Cynthia, has to kill Cynthia because unfortunately she's collateral damage, but kills the main target in Brenda and then leaves. Instead, as I had suggested earlier, if the killer stayed around waiting for Dorothy to return, then that would mean she was the target of the attack. And if there's any validity to this theory, I would speculate that more than likely, if it was a specific target, that person would have been Dorothy because it was her business. Maybe they were using it as a front. Maybe she was involved in something where she just had to look the other way. I don't know. As much as we don't have evidence to rule this theory out, we don't really have any evidence to support it. And I'm not the only one who thinks that, because Lincoln and Brian both pleaded not guilty and maintained their innocence, and eventually the murder charges were dropped. Officials said there wasn't enough evidence to move forward, and the case was complicated by prosecutorial misconduct. After the charges were dismissed, the Raleigh County Sheriff's Office said the triple homicide case was still open. They emphasized that the investigators remained committed to solving it. Since then, there have been no major developments. In 2018, the current sheriff at the time told the media that Brian was still considered the prime suspect. Now, it's unclear what investigators believe now, 7 years later. The last significant reporting came in 2021, marking 20 years since Cynthia, Brenda, and Dorothy were killed. The sheriff's office said a detective was assigned to the case in the event new information or evidence came forward. Former Sheriff Johnson also spoke to KPAC saying, quote, "In my career, this probably ranks as the toughest, most important case I ever investigated." He reminded the public that the case remains unsolved and urged people not to forget the victims. He ended his statement by saying, quote, "There were 3 innocent women that were productive neighbors of ours, and it changed our community and it changed our families. And it's good to never forget that each of us makes a difference, because these women all did." All right, let's dive into this perspective, and it's not going to be as long as some of my other ones because we talked about the theory involving a targeted attack possibly connected to drugs and or money. We can hit it again because it's important. They arrested 2 individuals on this theory, so clearly investigators believe that it's viable. And with knowing more information without having everything sealed, maybe I would hop on board as well. Maybe there's something in one of the women's past that would connect them to Brian and or Lincoln. But without it, it's all speculative for us. So I don't want to go too far in the weeds on that because I don't want to disrespect any of the victims when they're no longer here and their family members or friends may listen or watch this episode. But as I do in all cases, I have to be objective. And there may be something here that would suggest this was a targeted attack. When I think about the suspect here, and I think about who we could be looking for, to me, if I was to develop the profile, and I'm not a professional profiler, I think this is someone who's from that community. I think the way they left the salon, knowing the path to take, it either suggests some type of counterintelligence, some type of reconnaissance, or someone who was just familiar with the area because they grew up there. They knew how to get from the salon to an area where they could be picked up or they could escape on a vehicle that they had waiting there. One of those 2 scenarios to me seems very plausible. I don't think this was just some random person who was driving down Highway 93 and saw the hair gallery and decided to attack random people inside without knowing who was going to be there and how many people were going to be there. They walk in there and there's 10 people inside. Yeah, they still have a knife and they could do some damage, but more than likely someone's going to be able to get out of there and identify the killer later. So I feel like this does lean towards targeted attack by someone who is familiar with that community and someone who more than likely knew one or all of the women. If you made me choose, I think that if this is the theory we're going with, Dorothy was absolutely the target. That would explain why Brenda and Cynthia were killed and the killer stuck around. We still don't know 100% which door the killer exited the salon through. We know that the witness saw this person outside the salon, but did they go through the back door or did they come out the front door? That's important because if we're to believe that while trying to flee the area, the killer just ran into Dorothy and then killed her as well, then they would have continued through that back door. But if for some reason we were able to prove that the killer actually exited through the front door, then why were they at the back door? To me, that would suggest that they knew the pattern of behavior at that location. They knew that Dorothy would go every Tuesday to make a bank deposit and that she would come through that back door and more than likely her guard wouldn't be up. It's possible the killer went inside the salon not knowing if another person would be inside and maybe they were just going to wait around for Dorothy. But once they walked in and you have Brenda and Cynthia there, they have no choice but to kill them as well. But when you really unpack that, the killing of 2 innocent people just to get your one target, substantial. And it brings me back to motive. What would be the reasoning behind killing 3 people? What would be that significant that Dorothy or one of the other women were involved in where you would take them out in broad daylight in this manner? That's a real message to send. And again, without having this documents unsealed, we really can't dive into it. I would love to look into Dorothy's business dealings and even Brenda's business dealings to see if there's a connection, to see if maybe they were struggling financially. Could they have been in a scenario where they needed help and this was the quickest way to get that help. It wouldn't be the first time it's happened. So yes, I do think there's some credibility to the possibility that this was a targeted attack because of something that Dorothy and or Brenda was involved in. It's also possible that this was a random act of violence and that there was some sick individual out there who had known that these women were alone in this establishment most of the time, and they had an itch to scratch. They had been looking for a place where they could overwhelm their victims quickly, commit whatever crime they wanted to commit, and then get out of there as fast as possible using a point of egress, an exit route that they were familiar with, where they could park a vehicle or an all-terrain vehicle, something where they could go off into the woods and then disappear forever. Do I think that they were someone who had never been to this area before? As I said earlier, absolutely not. I think we're looking for someone who knows that area, who knows that community, and had known for a while that this location wasn't frequented by a ton of people at any period of time, so they could go in there, do what they wanted to do, carry out their quote-unquote fantasy, and it kills me to say that, and then get out of there most likely without being seen or apprehended. Unfortunately for them, a witness showed up and was able to at least get a partial image of what they look like, although unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have helped. But if I'm right, whether this is a targeted attack or a random act of violence, and this person is from that community, that means that someone there knows this individual, and for some reason, they haven't come forward. We need that. I don't think we're at a point right now where we can rely on DNA evidence or palm print to solve this one. The science and technology is there. Unless law enforcement hasn't resubmitted the evidence, that means it's just not viable. There's nothing there to actually examine. And if that's the case, that means we need one of you. We need a physical person to come forward and voice what they know so that investigators can connect the dots. So, just to recap, Dorothy Harris, Brenda Patch, and Cynthia Paulus were all found murdered inside the Hair Gallery Salon in Florence, Montana at around 11 a.m. on November 6, 2001. Money and personal belongings were left behind, and the only items missing were 2 hairdressing capes. Witnesses reported seeing a man in a dark suit with a stovepipe or fedora hat near the salon that morning, but despite sketches, composites, and an intensive search, he has never been identified. If you have any information in this case, please call the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office at 406-363-3033. My final words, as always, go out to the friends and family of Dorothy, Brenda, and Cynthia. 20 plus years, far too long to have this monster still out there living amongst us. I don't know who's around, but I know we have a lot of grandchildren who were young at the time when this occurred, but they still have to carry this burden every single year for the people that have left us. And I know deep down, if it were me, if it were someone I was close to, I would want those answers for my loved ones who may no longer be here. And most importantly, I'd want those answers for Brenda, Dorothy, and Cynthia. So we have an obligation as a community to find this person responsible because they need to be held accountable. And if it's Brian or Lincoln or someone else, someone knows what happened here. This isn't just a ghost. There is information tying back to this person. Their behavior changed the day before, the day of, or the day after. They're connected to someone. And for whatever reason, no one has felt the obligation to come forward yet, but it's not too late. You can do the right thing. You can make a difference in the lives of the people who are still here, still carrying the weight of what happened 20 plus years ago. I really hope I get that opportunity to sit here and tell you that the person responsible is finally behind bars. But until that day comes, everyone stay safe out there, and I'll see you soon.